All right, so today we're going to talk about the, as it says, theories of class and social inequalities. I'm going to break this section up into a few videos, and the very first one, the one we're going to do right now, is on Marx. Okay, so Marx, here's Marx on Wikipedia. You just have to have a picture of him here. Ta-da! There he is. All right. So, if you want to grow up to be an old revolutionary, you need to have a beard like that. Okay. Apparently, the video is hard on my computer. Okay. So the first thing you need to know about Marx is that everything comes from the economy. That's why this section of the book, of the outline, is entitled The Economic Foundation, and then the base and the superstructure. Essentially, the foundation is all the economy, how the economy works, and the superstructure is all of the cultural stuff that lays on top of that. All right? So, the primacy of economics in Marx defines Marx, and is one of the things that's different about him and the next theorist we're going to talk about, Weber. But essentially, all art, all culture, all intelligentsia, academics, all of it supported the economic foundation. It justified it, it legitimated it. If the economic foundation were let me say that differently. If the cultural products didn't support the economic foundation, they would simply not be followed. They wouldn't be. Those cultural things wouldn't have any traction, any credence, and no one would listen to them. Okay, so even something like religion follows from economics. This is where Marx has that famous saying, religion is the opiate of the masses. Well, from Marx's perspective, the reason, especially for him, Christianity, but the reason Christianity is such an opiate is because Christianity tells working people that it's okay if you're poor. In fact, it's better to be poor than it is to be rich. When we get to heaven, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And better to turn your cheek and put up with the deprivations of this life in the hopes that the next life is going to be great. Well, if you take a non-religious perspective on that and compare it to the kinds of workers needed in the capitalist society that Marx had, especially the one coming out of the agrarian society that existed before that, the idea of workers who aren't going to revolt, who are satisfied with their place as poor workers, who don't resent those who are in power, you almost couldn't come up with a better religion for peasants and factory workers, at least not for keeping them in their place. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity is this way or isn't this way, but it's important for you to recognize that for Marx, it very much was this way. And a religion of individual empowerment isn't going to fly in a world that relies upon factory workers and peasants. Okay, so for Marx, that's the base, the economic foundation, and the superstructure: culture, religion, everything else. Okay. Okay. So now, class division. This class is stratification. So it's about who are the different kinds of people and where do they fit. And so for Marx, everything in the class division comes down to the means of production right here. Now, the means of production is essentially the tools through which the economy is made. All right. So step one in understanding this is that Marx approaches humans as animals. As animals, we have basic animal needs: food, water, shelter, reproduction, and the economy is how we meet those needs. Okay, so an agrarian society uses farming to meet those needs of food, water, shelter. A herding society uses the animals that it follows to meet those needs. An industrial society uses factories to meet those needs. And an information society uses computers to meet those needs. And note that I'm talking to you through a computer and you're listening to me through a computer because we're in an information age. Okay, now the means of production, so if the economy is the way that we're meeting our individual human needs as animals and as a society, and then the means of production are those tools that fulfill those needs, that create the products we need for those needs. So in an agrarian society, the most important mean of production is going to be the land. If you don't own land, you're not well-to-do. The next step is going to be owning the tools, but the tools have to follow the land, right? You have to have animals, you have to have what else do you have to have? Hose, whatever, seeds, all of that stuff. But first and foremost, you have to have land. All right. So the means of production are land and the associated tools that go with it, and the okay. And so who owns those tools, those means of production, is the most important differentiator in a class system that follows from that. Okay, so in an agrarian system, who owns the land is who is wealthy. And when you think back to feudal times, you probably think of two different classes of people. One are the serfs, the peasants. They don't own any land. They work the land that's owned by the king. The king owns a lot of land, and maybe some of the aristocracy does too. If they don't own it, then they are in charge of overseeing it for the king. And if you're a peasant, how do you ever actually arise to a position where you own that land? It's going to be a challenge. You're going to have trouble doing it. All right. So, yeah, that's the means of production and the ownership of the means of production. In our world, well, let's actually step back. In Marx's world, the means of production were factories, because Marx was in a world that was rapidly going from agrarian to industrialization, going to industrialism, and those industrial factories were what generated food, products, essentially wealth. Okay, so in 1850, when Marx is writing, whoever owned the factories were the ones who were in control of things. They were going to be as wealthy as the kings of old ever were. The kings of old held land. Modern industrialists held the factories. Okay, now in that environment, the two classes that matter are the ownership class and the labor class. The ownership class, the capitalist class here, Marx called the bourgeoisie. The ownership class he called the proletariat, the labor class he called the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie, they own the factories. The proletariat, they don't own anything except their lives, which they sell in terms of hourly labor to the bourgeoisie. Okay. Now it's important to note that in Marx's system, you'll notice that being the owner of the means of production means you can exploit or harvest value from the workers who are actually doing the work producing. So the reason kings were so fabulously wealthy in the feudal era was because they could extract enormous taxes from the peasants that they ruled, and sometimes you would hear of taxes in the order of 50% of the harvest would go straight to the king. In our world, the extraction is, well, if you're a capitalist, you call it profit. If you're a Marxist, you call it surplus value. But essentially, all of the wealth that I have as a capitalist is a result of having my employees work, paying them a certain amount, but that amount is less than the value of their labor to me. So if I can get someone to work on a factory line and build a widget, and I can get them to do it for $50 a day, but I can sell that widget for $100, well, then there's $50 worth of surplus value. Marx and hardcore capitalists do not disagree on this. Capitalists call it profit. Marxists call it surplus value. Okay. Now, from a Marxian perspective, that surplus value wouldn't happen without the labor actually performing labor, right? So if the employee didn't agree to work in the factory at all, then there's no value for the capitalist to harvest. All right. At the same time, when you look at the enormous wealth of the capitalists, you'll recognize it's not because the capitalist did anything other than set up a certain equation. All of that wealth represents value taken from working people's lives. Okay? So think about that next time you're watching a Disney princess movie with your kids. The reason those people are so well-to-do, from a Marxist perspective, is precisely because the peasants worked so hard and created that wealth for the kings. When you see beautiful antebellum architecture, that wealth came from, well, somebody had to create that wealth, right? Okay. Now, false consciousness. Well, let me double check the hegemony bit here. So the hegemony is a $10 word for saying that you're in power, you're in control of a situation. Political scientists will talk about the United States being a hegemon in today's world. We're the powerful, we're in control. We have a certain amount of influence in making the world go the way we want that smaller countries just don't actually have. So in a capitalist world, not only, so this echoes the cultural superstructure, insofar as art, intelligentsia, religion all echo and support the capitalist system. In the hegemony component here, not only is that all true on the cultural side, it's also true on the political side. So when it comes down to who writes the rules, how are the rules enforced, you'll notice that over and over and over again, they're written in such a way that it supports the people in power. So that, from a simple moral perspective, sometimes people in power can do things which people who are not in power cannot do, because the rules are written a certain way. And why are the rules written that way? They're written that way because the capitalist class is the one who's in a position to write those rules and make definitions. We could have a long conversation about how that works in the modern world, and we will as the semester goes on. But it's interesting to note that this is not anything that's new. This is a 150-year-old discussion coming from Marx. Yeah. So in an agrarian, in a feudal system, the king has a lot of latitude into the levers he can take, how he can treat his peasants, whom he can torture and sometimes kill, how much freedom of speech, to use our terminology, he would have, and in such a way that his peasants don't have any of those freedoms whatsoever. Like the exact same behavior at the peasant level would result in that peasant getting tortured and killed, even though the sort of human moral or theologically moral value of cheating on your spouse or speaking out against something you think is unfortunate, or speaking out against the church, right? There's different ways that those rules are written in the first place, different way those rules are enforced, and different ways those rules are punished depending upon where you are in the system, right? So from a Marxist perspective, the political system and the justice system are a result also of that capitalist class. So when you see the police picture, when the police car says, to protect and serve, just imagine the ruling class, and you have an understanding of what Marx is talking about. There is a picture there. Here it is. Okay, so this isn't just some protester being a smart aleck. This is actually exactly what Marxists' hegemony of the capital class means. That the systems that we have exist to serve and protect those who are in power. Okay. Now, false consciousness. False consciousness is a little bit tricky. In the same way that we just talked about culture or superstructure reflecting the capital system, and the hegemony of the capital class ensuring that the political and justice systems reflect those guys' best interests. False consciousness, it has an echo of the brain fart, and I just said it too. The opiate of the masses. So think about this from, again, a Marx perspective. If the peasants and serfs realized that the power of the king and the wealth of the king was a direct result of what they had produced in terms of labor, and if those peasants recognized there were way more of them than there were the aristocracy who was harvesting that wealth from them, those peasants could be pretty dangerous, right? In the same way, in an old-fashioned industrial system, when you have a town where a small percentage, 25%, are the folks who are at the top, with the very few who are the actual owners of everything, and then you've got all of these working class proletariat. If they were to ever recognize that the wealth of those at the very top was actually because of the work they had done, they would be very dangerous, right? So not only, in the religious perspective, from the criticism of religion Marx had, religion is the opiate of the masses. It keeps them from recognizing how they're being exploited, right? But it's not just religion. In fact, there are all sorts of things which keep the working folk, the people on the bottom, from recognizing they have shared interests, including a certain belief in the system. Okay, so when you and I watch, there used to be the show on TV, The Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, or when we watch the Kardashians or Paris Hilton, and we see how fabulously wealthy they are, and then we say to ourselves, I know we can do it, right? Hopefully someday we'll be there. We're not recognizing that we'll never be there. We'll never be there because we don't own those systems which are making those people so well-to-do, and the chance of us achieving that is next to nothing. But as long as we're all watching and dreaming, we're not working together to ensure a fairer distribution of the products of those systems, the profits of those systems. All right. So when you start thinking about false consciousness from a Marxist perspective, the false consciousness is anything that keeps us from recognizing our shared interest as working people. And when you start thinking about that, there's an awful lot of it. So let's start with the religion one. What a thing for Christianity to have this idea of a glorious afterlife and turn the other cheek. That's great in terms of keeping people from recognizing what it is they actually share. But it's even better because not only does Christianity cause this otherworldly perspective, which Marx would say keeps us from acting in the here and now. All the different kinds of Christians don't like each other. If you walk up to the right kind of Christian and say, oh yeah, I love it, I'm Catholic, they're going to look at you a little bit crooked because no, that doesn't count. So even people who should have a shared understanding of the world because they're part of a religion which is very, very close to each other, they're going to dicker with each other about who's right and who's wrong, this flavor of Baptists or this flavor of Catholics. And never mind the Mormons, right? The Mormons are over here. They're all variants of Christianity, but as long as they aren't willing to work with each other because they're the wrong variant, the capital class doesn't have to worry at all. So just send them some more money for some more churches and everything's going to be great because they're going to be arguing about which, who gets to go to heaven, not recognizing that they should be working together to change who's actually running things. But church is just the very first beginning. Here in the United States, we've got the blue states and the red states. Now, you'll notice that for all of our stereotypes about each other, the blue states and the red states are mostly working people because they have to be mostly working people. Now, what a funny thing, what a great thing for the capital class, the elite, as long as the agricultural red states with shotguns and pickups and camo, right? As long as those guys don't like the urban states with voting Democrat and being oriented around cities and whatever else makes urban states, gun control legislation, whatever. As long as we're fighting about this with each other, we're not noticing who's actually running the whole system. So, just keep stirring the pot, keep the Democrats and the Republicans hating each other, fighting each other. There doesn't even have to really be much difference between the parties. All we need is that the people down here to think there's a difference, and then to think that difference, and then fight with each other. And it works brilliantly, right? Not just politically, but culturally. The Reds and the Blues don't like each other at all. What are some more examples? You'll hear people get anything that divides people who really should be fairly connected in their understandings of things. The Harley riders don't like the crotch rocket guys, but they're all getting run over by cars. But as long as they're bickering with each other, they're not, debating the system where they really are, underprivileged on the streets relative to cars. I love the Ford and Chevy debates, as if there's a difference. Of course, the guys who are watching right now, oh my goodness, there's a difference. But whatever, they're American pickups. You put a little tweak here, it's a Ford. You put a little tweak here, it's a Chevy. But But the people that like American pickups are really pretty close to each other and have much more in common than they have differences. But if they're going to debate about this and get all their emotional energy wound up in this, they're never going to recognize who's actually running these larger things. Sports teams are fun. But again, if you really are not going to work with this person because, they like the Phillies instead of the Braves, it's perfect, right? So all this stuff is false consciousness. All these things are us believing in differences and getting wound up by differences and believing in the overarching system without ever recognizing that the real difference is between those who are running the overarching system and us, and the real friction is between them making money off of us. Okay, so that's a long discussion of false consciousness. Okay, so class conflict. Now, Marx is working with a fairly mechanical version of history, meaning this happens here, and then this happens here, and then this happens here. He developed a lot of his ideas off of old-fashioned Hegel, and Hegel had this idea that history moves in these steps, right? So here's an idea. Intellectual history works great. Here's an idea. Here's the reaction to that idea, which addresses some of the weaknesses that this idea had, but this idea itself is probably a little bit too far this way. So you've got the thesis, the antithesis, the antithesis, and then the next step is here, where the good parts about this one, but minus some of its bad parts, the good parts about this one minus some of its overcompensation, right, come together to become the synthesis, right? So you've always got these things, this nice, like I said, mechanical movement from here to here to here to here. Okay, for Marx adopts that idea from Hegel, and Hegel uses it for history, uses it for ideas. Marx adopts it and applies it to economic history. So any system is like the thesis, right? So and any system, as we said before, is essentially an economic system, a means of production. So when you've got something like when you've got feudalism, it's a stable system, right? You've got the land is where most of the wealth comes from. The workers work the system. The kings own the land and harvest the wealth from the people. It's pretty stable, and it lasted a very long time. However, there was this gap, right? And this gap was merchants. And when you take the merchants who are trading back and forth and making a little bit of money, well, money never mattered in feudal system, because in the feudal system it's really about land. Okay, so these guys are making money here, and at the same time you've also got mechanization, people trying to make machines better at doing things, and then in the late 1700s you start, and then the early 1800s you have the explosion of fossil fuels to start driving those machines, right? So you've got mechanistic development in your means of production, making things more efficient, but then you've also got the power equivalent. Without fossil fuels, everything has to be run off of oxes or water wheels or windmills, stuff like that. And the aristocracy in the feudal era doesn't care, because they're focused on maintaining control of the land. That's where they see their wealth coming from, so that's what they're focused on. So while this is a stable system, there's a gap in the role that the merchants play. And when that widens a little bit because of mechanization and the advent of fossil fuel power, they start making money. That's okay, because the kings are still focused on their land. The peasants are just doing what peasants are doing. Yet these guys are making money, and then they're able to take some of that money and go from handcraft to more, higher production factories. And so then they're making more money and more money. And the economic system here is actually changing while the feudal people aren't noticing because they're so focused on land. Until eventually, these guys over here, this new industrial economic system, has grown to a point where it's already ready to supplant the aristocracy, the feudal system of kings and lands. And they didn't know it until it was too late. This was already so powerful that there wasn't anything they could do. And this doesn't care about land so much. Land becomes an input, it matters, but more important than the land is what you're doing with the products from the land. So that, bam, eventually industrialism grows, modern capitalism grows to become its own thing, but it grew from the seeds, the cracks in the foundation of the feudal system. Okay, when you recognize that Marx sees a system falling apart because of its own internal contradictions, its own internal cracks, then you also can see, all right, you can see him thinking through capitalism. So if that's how systems grow in the cracks of an old system until they bloom, until they become so large that their own internal cracks and contradictions can't support it anymore, what are the contradictions and cracks in capitalism? And for Marx, one of the biggest was, there were really two. One, the first was, once labor recognized that they were being exploited, once they realized that all of the wealth of the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Hiltons was a result of them working and them spending their money, then they have control. Once they recognize it, and they recognize it all together, they can either A, go take the means of production and control it. They could B, stop spending their money and control it. There's a lot of different ways they can improve their lot, but once they recognize it, and how can they not recognize it? They're standing next to each other at factories all day long, right, doing whatever the work is, while they get poorer and poorer and poorer. Yet the factory owners get richer and richer and richer. Okay, the second component was that capitalism itself has these business cycles. Now again, there's nobody disagrees with this. Every free market person understands the business cycles here, but for Marx, on the downside of a business cycle, and free market people would agree with this, on the downside of a business cycle, you end up squeezing out inefficient producers, the smaller producers, and then on the swing back up, all of the assets of those smaller producers can be bought and put into the larger, more productive systems. Okay, so as your system, every time you have a downswing, more and more of the small businesses crash and burn, and on the upswing, the bigger businesses grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. A perfect example of this would be, go try and find a small local bookstore where you can talk to the owner, have a cup of coffee, and the owner's going to recommend you some books to read, right? Well, those guys were run out 2 or 3 business cycles ago, and to the point where even on the last crash, Borders was run out, and you kind of wonder how Barnes & Noble is doing. Well, who's scraping up all that work? It's Amazon, and Amazon's huge. Same thing with a local hardware store, hard to find. Lowe's has run most of them out of business, these big things. Local grocery, good luck, there's no one who's going to be able to make money doing that. We all go to Super Walmart to get our groceries now, or maybe Kroger or Publix or whatever, but the places that are doing it are these huge mammoth companies, and they're so far removed from Steve's Grocery, the 3-aisle store that I used to go get milk at when I was a kid. That kind of thing is just absolutely gone. And why? Because as the business cycles continue, those small producers get squeezed out and the big producers pick them up. So that today we live in a world of mammoth corporations, and it's hard to find those small business owners. Now, so between the fact that working people can see that they're not doing much better while the wealthy class is doing much, much better, and the fact that these business cycles happened, Marx is kind of thinking, if you've ever played Monopoly, what happens when one person finally has all the money, right? Well, the game's over. So Marx is kind of wondering, as these business cycles get bigger and bigger and bigger, and as people get more and more laid off, at what point does the Monopoly game end, right? And since you can't fold up the board and go make sandwiches in the economy, what does it mean when the Monopoly game of the economy ends, right? And that's where Marx is trying to think forward and understand what's going to happen, right? So those are the contradictions. He expects there to be a point where the system just kind of comes to a stop, right? He also thinks that there's a point where, as the economy grinds into some sort of crisis, that the working people of the world recognize, the factories still exist. They can still make the products, right? They can, everything we need to make food, to make shelter, to make TVs is still there. The only problem is the Monopoly game crashed. For Marx, that's where the crisis is going to be. Okay, so boy, this is a busy slide. But I took all of these from, as it says, page 33. Okay, so reality consists of production of basic life needs. We covered that. Societies in different stages create different productive systems. We covered that. In all societies, a class division evolves between those who own and those who work. We covered that. Class struggle is the contest between these two classes. We covered that. And productive systems give way to the next systems, right? We covered that. Only what we didn't cover is, or I didn't cover it much, is when our system reaches that crisis point, what's the next thing? For Marx, he thought it was going to be socialism or communism. That's been sort of a problem for Marx because that hasn't actually happened. And the book talks, do we have 4 pages of Marx? Egads. So the book talks a little bit about why Marx's systems didn't work out, and this is pretty good here. As a small aside, Marx is an interesting example of why we need to be careful with what we think we know. Marx is a great example of a kind of a hubristic sense of our own knowledge. Like Marx's analysis is good. Marx's explanations of what's going on are good. I like quite a bit of his writing on these things, and yet when he tried to project forward, it didn't all happen. So we can look for excuses. Oh, it didn't work because, or we can look for explanations. Well, here's where he was wrong. Here's where he was wrong. We do need to try and figure out if he was wrong, because one reason he could have been wrong was he wasn't right in his assumptions. But the world is so complex and human knowledge is so complex that he could have been right in all of his assumptions and still been wrong here. Okay, but going forward, so one of the things is the class struggle didn't get more acute. We say the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This was true in 1850, so 200 years later, 175 years later, we should wonder why it didn't happen, right? If the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer in 1850, we should either all be living in opulence or in dirt huts, right? and part of the thing is that the struggle didn't intensify the way he thought. It didn't get more acute. Number two here, the division of labor intensified. His system was really fairly binary. You either evolved into an owner or a proletariat, the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. For the most part, he assumed people were going to end up in the proletariat side. But in the last 150 years, the economy has come up with new products, new systems. It's gone through its own couple of revolutions as we've gone from the old-fashioned industry to, for instance, in farming, the green revolution of the 60s and 70s, where science gave us all this new technology to make our crops better, and we're even going through another whole revolution now of the information age with computers and the internet influencing the economy. And every time it's done that, there have been a new crop of entrepreneurs, a few who are huge winners, but whole new industries evolve where people can actually have nice middle-class lives. And he didn't kind of see that. He didn't expect that for whatever reason. Okay, this one too, who the capitalists are. So in our world, in Marx's world, a capitalist was someone who owned a factory. And when you saw a factory, it was owned by a person or a family. In our world, all of us own the goods of production because many of our most productive companies are publicly traded companies. If I have a 401k and that 401k has shares of stock of Coke in it, then I actually own part of Coca-Cola. Of course, there's a family that originally owned Coca-Cola, but the moment they took it public, we all become owners of this. And if the system's working the way we hope it does, and everybody's putting money into their 401k, then the entire American middle class is actually part of that ownership class. Not only that, but in today's world, it's possible to have a position where you're not part of the ownership class, but you do have a very comfortable life. And part of that is because you're the one who is helping make decisions. So again, if we go up to Coke World headquarters in Atlanta, there are a whole host of upper management positions where the people who are making decisions there have a lot of control over how Coke's money gets spent, how Coke's employees get hired and fired, what markets Coke moves into. They're actually making decisions that are influencing people's lives that would be a little bit problematic if we reserved that ownership class, that title of bourgeoisie, only for the ownership class. So who actually owns things and who makes decisions has changed in this world. Okay, the next one here, workers' material state to improve. What they're talking about here is that even if you have a fairly humble production job, I don't know, let's say you have two factory workers who are making $30,000 a year. They don't have to be factory workers, but you have a couple, and each one of them is making $30,000 a year, which is roughly $15 an hour, and they're working full time. Together, the two of them are going to make $55,000, $60,000, and $60,000 isn't, you're not going to get rich, but it's not bad money in today's world. You might not be sending your kids to the fancy private schools, but you're going to have a TV, you're going to have air conditioning, you're going to have a couple of cars. Your material estate is pretty good. And if we compare that to the actual material state of the factory workers in Marx's time, the people that he was concerned with, it's a difference that is hard to even put into words. Many of them lived in shanties, whole families living in a one or a two-room apartment. Those workers are working 10, 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. There's no safety rules. If they get hurt on the job, which would happen on a regular basis, then they couldn't work. But if they didn't take risks, they weren't going to be able to do the job and make money in the first place. So when you're considering that kind of material living condition, that kind of working environment, and compare it with today's, our people are much, much, much better off. Even our, mostly poor people. So, which is interesting to think about, because if our working classes had to live the way London working classes did in 1850, or had to work in the environment of a 1900 Chicago slaughterhouse, we really might have revolutions, because those were some terrible working environments. But it's just not the case nowadays. It doesn't mean that our poor aren't struggling, but they're struggling in different ways than the poor that Marx was talking about when he did. Okay, the socialist experiments mostly failed. This is kind of true. I think you guys probably understand that. Cuba succeeded, but everybody lost on average 20 pounds, and society actually kind of seems to have gone backwards a little bit. Russia didn't win. China's booming now precisely because they're backing off of their socialist experiment. Both Russia and China had atrocious death rates when the socialists were in charge of running things. We don't like to talk about them much, but both of them were much larger than Hitler's genocides, which is pretty troubling. So the socialist experiments that we've had, if Cuba is the best of them, that's saying a lot. All right. This one here, class consciousness was never achieved. Yeah, we're nowhere near that. There's a hint of it in country music, but just a hint. But the funny thing is while there's a hint of class consciousness in country music, it's backstopped by a deep belief in the system. And one that's not on here, but which maybe has to be, is maybe the reason we haven't had the crisis is because industrial capitalism hadn't gotten as far as it needed to in terms of globally. There's still part of the reason that the U.S. had some rough times in the 70s and 80s was because that's when offshoring was first really taking off. It was cheaper to put a factory here, and it was cheaper to put a factory here. And so our factory workers lose their jobs. It may be that we don't bump into the crisis until most of the world is sucked into the system we have. As long as there's a cheaper place to put a factory, then that's what's going to happen. And capitalism will keep on going. Those of us in the middle classes in the developed world, we might see our standard of living stagnate, but at the same time, the rest of the world is growing. Okay. Oh, goodness. You can read this part out of the book. I am tired of Marx for now. Okay.